you on behalf of the National Reentry Resource Center, a project of the Council for State Government Justice Center. You have joined a webinar on identifying and engaging reentry mentors for justice-involved youth. I want to thank the Bureau of Justice Assistance, the Office of Justice Programs at the U.S. Department of Justice for supporting the National Reentry Resource Center and this webinar. I want to also thank our fellow panelists who are on the call with me today. I want to ask them when they're not in the presentation mode to please remember to mute their phones so we don't have any background noise. And when it's time for you to present, you can take yourselves off mute, and that way we minimize the potential interruptions to the broadcast. After the presentations by our speakers today, there'll be a time for a question and answer session. If you want to submit a question, and you're free to do this during the course of the webinar, please type the question into the Q&A panel on the bottom right hand of your screen. We'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible. If history is any record of what's going to happen today, we're going to have more questions than we can handle, but that's a good problem to have. If you do encounter technical or audio problems during the webinar, please call WebEx Technical Support. I'm going to give you that phone number. It's 1-866-229-3239. Please understand that there are some technical issues you may not be able to resolve during the webinar today. Again, that number is 1-866-229-3239. And if the problem cannot be resolved, we are recording the event, and we'll be emailing a link to the recording to all of the attendees, so you will be able to log on and see it at another point in time or listen to it. As I said, I'm Shea Bilchik, and I'm at Georgetown University. I'm delighted to be part of the steering committee for the National Reentry Resource Center and chairing the Juvenile Justice Advisory Committee for this effort. I'm joined today by Roger Jajura, Associate Professor at the School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University, Purdue University in Indianapolis, founder, Aftercare for the Incarcerated Through Mentoring Project, Dennis Talbert, President of the Michigan Neighborhood Partnership, and David Altshuler, Principal Research Scientist at Johns Hopkins University Institute for Public Policy. And I am looking at the screen here, the cover screen of the webinar, and for some reason my computer is not. There we go, I've got it now. Okay, so there you see the presenters for the program. What follows is a presentation outline, which will lay out for you what we intend to cover today. I'll be doing a short introduction of the program, and then I'll be turning it over to Roger to be talking about the 8 principles for identifying and engaging community mentors. And then Dennis Talbert will take over and talk about the identifying community mentors within the life of the mentee, some practical application information. And then David Altshuler will come on to the broadcast and give us an overview of mentorship in a reentry and reintegration context. This is part of a broader series of things that we're doing at the National Reentry Resource Center, including previous webinars, to try to lift up and improve practice out in the field around reentry. So this webinar, as you can see on the screen, was preceded by 2 other webinars, the Juvenile Reentry in Concept and Practice in January 2010, and then one in October, early October, on family engagement and reentry for justice-involved youth. In that broadcast, which is available to you online, we covered information from the Family Justice Program through the very Institute of Justice, some of the tools that they've developed, a family-focused approach through the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation Division of Juvenile Justice, and then a practical application called Adolescent Portable Therapy, which was highlighted during the broadcast as well. So more of that information can be found at the website so you can see what things that we're doing. Besides the webinars, we are also developing frequently asked questions and also developing materials that will be available to the field on juvenile justice reentry. So what do we mean by family, and why is it so important? From an ecological perspective and a risk and protective perspective, we focus on domains such as family, school, peer group, community, and self. When you look at this particular slide, you see that we really are extending the definition, therefore the quotations around family, to be those immediate family members, extended family members, and mentors and other external supports. So when we work with family, we want the clients we work with to define family broadly. This is this extended family, so to speak, that will really be the support system we believe that needs to be there for young people besides the formal system involvement in which they find themselves. So first principle here is allow people to define who makes up their family. And this can be their traditional birth family, their mothers, their fathers, their brothers and sisters. It can extend into more extended family members, as grandparents, uncles, cousins, nieces, nephews, people who can be there within the blood family. And then people they elect to bring into their lives, mentors, coaches, friends, a community center director, a neighbor, people who bring something to the table for them that's going to help them to get through this tough stretch in their lives. What I think we want to do in undertaking this work is really take a strength-based approach. Within certain limitations, in terms of limiting this reach to only positive pro-social individuals, we embrace these individuals in terms of how they can become part of our case planning and, in essence, our case management, and hopefully part of that child's life in a meaningful way long after the system has exited their life. Using a strength-based approach means that we assume, again, with some due diligence, that we want to make sure we don't introduce negative influences, but that all people are motivated, that they operate with the belief that everyone possesses talents, abilities, capacities, and past successes, which sometimes can be a push and pull on who we want to bring into the child's life and who we don't, and that they will draw on strengths to motivate behavior change for the young person. So when we look at the impact of family and other social supports on reentry outcomes, I mean, it shouldn't surprise us that the evidence-based programs that we see now in vogue generally reflect some level of family involvement. There's some family component within them. It's reflective of the ecological model. Whether it's functional family therapy, multisystemic therapy, multidimensional treatment, foster care, the list goes on. These promising evidence-based type programs have some family dynamic, and this is really reflected and supported by the research. So you see here the finding from Klein, it's all the way back to 1977. This isn't new research, but it certainly has been added to by current research in the field, that a family systems approach not only reduces recidivism rates but for the offender, but also for the siblings involved in the justice system. Again, this makes sense, because if we impact the family, we impact not only the young person, but the young person's siblings. And then secondly, that youth who participated in a family systems therapy had markedly lower recidivism rates, as recently found in 2004 by Hinton. When we at our center here at Georgetown sought to reach out to the field, to corrections officials, to juvenile justice officials, and probation, we conducted a survey, and you see the findings here on this PowerPoint slide. That when we asked them, and we gave them about 25 different options, we asked them how they would rank family engagement in terms of an operational issue, in terms of its importance, they rated it one of the top three. When we asked them to look at the difficulty of the issues they faced, it was the number one most difficult operational issue facing their department of agency, whether that was a corrections agency or whether that was a probation agency. So clearly, we have before us the opportunity and the challenge of how to better engage families, define broadly, members of the community, critical people involved in the young person's life with whom we're working, in terms of assuming this kind of mentoring, guiding relationship. I'm delighted now to turn it over to Roger Jajura to take us through the 8 principles for identifying and engaging community mentors. Roger?
Okay, thanks, Shay. So I'm going to lay out for you a series of principles to kind of structure your thinking about how you might identify and engage what we're calling community mentors. And then you're going to hear some examples, too, later in this program. So just real quick, 2 caveats. So your program may already be connecting young people that are in reentry with a mentor. And so I'll refer to that kind of mentor as an assigned mentor. This is somebody who your program is matching with a young person, and there's probably some defined period of time that they're being asked to be involved in the young person's life. In addition, we're encouraging you in this webinar to envision other supportive adults that are present in the community or the young people are going to be living and working and playing. And I'm going to be referring to these mentors as community mentors. So these will be people that will encourage you to think about how you can connect with the young people, but they're not there they're in addition to the assigned mentors that your program is putting in place already. So the first principle is to start with a big vision for the ultimate outcome. The ultimate outcome for the young people in your program, I'm going to suggest, might be to become productively engaged adult citizens. So there's no reason why the young people in our program we would have different outcomes for than the young people that we know in other areas of our life, including our children, siblings, other kids that we're involved in. So we don't want to aim too low. If we think about it, why would the kids that we serve be different from our own children? And if you imagine that your own son or daughter is incarcerated and is coming up for release, what kinds of support would you like to see him or her have so that they could have a successful transition, not only from incarceration back to the community, but as they move on to the next stages in their life? Now, I want to think about, so if you think about for your own kids, do you want them perhaps to find employment? Maybe you're looking for them to get back into school. And think about, would you want the future for your son or daughter to include college? So if so, then who is going to help make that happen? I mean, who can we connect them to make that happen? And I would suggest that you're probably going to try to pull out all the stops to connect them with the supports that would make a difference for that young person. You might think about whether your son or daughter could benefit from life skills training and support. And if you can't be the person that can provide it, because oftentimes a parent isn't the one that a young person tends to look to for that kind of support, then what kind of person would it be? And so you want to think about how hard would you advocate to get the right kinds of support in place for your own son and daughter, and think about why you wouldn't do that, why you wouldn't work that hard for the kids that you're serving. And I would say that if you think about what are the developmental tasks for adolescents as they move towards being a productive, engaged adult in our society, we're talking about competency, focusing on competency. So how can they develop the skills that it's going to take to be able to make a living for themselves and their family? Life skills are going to be involved here. We certainly want to come from a strengths-based perspective and focus on positive youth development. This is going to involve building up their interpersonal skills, their emotional intelligence, making them more accountable for their own actions, and building their skills in decision-making and problem-solving as well. Now, here's what we know about mentoring programs. When we do it right, mentoring programs can inspire and guide people to pursue successful and productive futures and help them reach their potential, and that's through positive relationships and the utilization of community resources. So we already know that if we do it right, that can work. We know that mentoring can be transformative, but for mentoring to be transformative, we're looking for mentors to sort of go beyond that simple hanging out that you might do with young people. And so if we prepare the mentors properly, we can inspire them to influence the young people in meaningful and significant ways. So they're moving towards a more productive future, changing the trajectory of their life. And we know also that when we're working with young people, when a mentor is working with a young person, we don't often see immediate short-term changes, but long-term personal growth that adults attribute back to having had a mentor in their life, we know that happens. And so when we talk to adults who had mentors when they were teenagers, they'll tell you that when they were involved with the mentor actively, they may not have immediately done things the way the mentor would have wanted them to do. But they almost always attribute their success as adults to having had those mentors in their lives when they were younger. And so that's what we know that's going to be true, and so we hold on to that, and we think about how can we build in more of those kinds of supportive adults so that young people have the best chance possible to be successful. Second principle is to create a map of the strengths and the gaps for the young people, their family, and the community. So we're looking for a way that we can figure out where the strengths are for that young person and their family, and where are the gaps. Where can we build in some other additional supports? Now, think about the risk factors that contribute to the likelihood that young people are going to be delinquent. These are things like, they have a dysfunctional family. They're having problems in school. They have challenges around work. They have negative peers. They're involved with drugs and alcohol. They live in disadvantaged neighborhoods. They experience low academic achievement. They have low self-esteem. And the choices that they're spending about their leisure time. Right? So if you think about it, these are the risk factors. We've heard all these before. Now, I'm going to suggest that we can reframe all of those in terms of dysfunctional relationships. The relationships the kids have with their families, the relationships they have with their teachers, the relationships they have with work, the relationship they have with their peers, the relationship they have with drugs and alcohol, the relationship they have with the community, the relationship they have with learning, the relationship they have with themselves, the relationship they have with their free time, the relationship they have with money. So we could think about how can we build in skills in each of these areas so that we can transform these to healthy relationships. And so the goal here is to imagine the support of adults that could assist in building those healthy relationships. That's kind of the idea here. So you'll recall from the previous webinar that we had about a month ago, you were presented with this model. This is an eco-map that comes, I just took this image right from the website for the Family Justice Program at the Vera Institute for Justice. And so this helps us think about what kinds of supports are already in place for the family. How are they already connected to governmental services, community resources? And this looks at a variety of informal and formal organizations. So I would encourage you to visit the website for the Family Justice Program and take a look at these tools and how they might assist in your own program and working with and mapping out for the kids that you're working with where they already are supports and where there might be some gaps there. I also want to point out and make sure that you're thinking about how to map the full context in which the young people are living and learning and working and playing. I think that context is typically underestimated. This is an excerpt that comes from the vision statement of the National Juvenile Detention Association. It says the most efficient way to return a juvenile to a healthy, law-abiding lifestyle is through healthy relationships with healthy adults in healthy environments. If you think about it, that's a pretty high standard. But it challenges us as providers to think about how to make the environment healthier or how to get them to spend more time in healthier environments. It's also about how to connect them with the right adults. Who are going to be some healthy adults that they could spend some time with? And then I also want to say a little bit about time, too. Time, I like to suggest, is a bit of a numbers game. So if you think about how many, real quick off the top of your head, how many hours are there in a week? There's actually 168 hours. Now think about the amount of time that you're asking your assigned mentors to spend with the young people. And it may be something like 1 or 2 hours a week, right? And 1 to 2 hours a week would be a good amount of time that a mentor could spend with the young person. But where are they spending the other 166 hours? And who are the other people that they're in the company with at that time? So we want to think about how do we build up more of the support, because this ultimately becomes a numbers game. If you think about it, it's amazing that mentoring could have an impact, given that the ratio of time that they spend to all of the other influences in their life. Third principle, it's important that the young person himself or herself has a voice in the identification of potential community members. So I'm suggesting here that we actually ask the young people about adults that they've been involved with in the past, in school, in church, in community settings, that they would say to you is a positive role model and somebody that they would like to be involved with for support over the long term. Now, if you think about who are these kids going to nominate and what's going to be true about them, they're going to nominate people that they would be excited to count among their supporters, and they're going to think about characteristics of people that they admire, right? They're not going to tell you about the teachers that told them that they weren't going to amount to anything. They're not going to tell you about people that they didn't have a good relationship with. They're going to recall the people that they honestly believed in the time that they spent with them that adult cared about them. And that's somebody that they would be excited to be able to access some support from. So they're going to pick the kinds of people that they would want to learn from and get support from. And then you would follow up with those people and ask them to get involved. Now, we know that people are more likely to get involved if somebody that they're in a relationship with asks them. So this is a way to kind of make that connection, right? A young person that they know about that's from their community has nominated them to be the supporter. And we want to be explicit. We want to make sure that they understand what we're asking. We're asking for a long-term commitment, right? This is not just, for the next 6 months or the next year. We want them to be available over the long term, but not in heavy doses, so not, 2 hours a week for the next 10 years, but that they would be available over the long term when the young person is going to need that kind of support. And let them know that you're going to provide some initial training, too, so that they understand how best to provide the support. The fourth principle, then, is that you're going to provide training for the community mentors, so they understand their role and they understand the expectations of your programs. You want to make sure that in your training that you're building in the kinds of practices that you know are going to help support the retention of these mentors. Because we know that when we put mentors in positions where they're not sure how to handle the situation and they don't really have anybody to check in with, or it's not what they were expecting, or it seems too hard, they're likely to terminate the relationship, so to basically walk away. And so want to make sure that you build in enough support and anticipation up front as to what they can expect so that they're not going to leave when it starts to feel like it's tough. And you'll look for ways that you can maintain their motivation. So this is where your program is going to take advantage of what you already have that's in place now for training, supervision, ongoing support, keeping them accountable, and then recognizing their efforts too. The fifth principle is to find a mechanism that allows you to create that buy-in and getting the commitment for the support of adults. A good model is the Permanency Pacts that you'll find if you want. Here's an excellent toolkit that's available for you for free. It's at the website www.fosterclub.org. And so you can go and you can download. The materials are free for you as long as you use them as they're designed, but they're readily available. So I encourage you to take a look at that. So the key here really is you're looking for supportive adults that the young person identified, that has an existing or previous relationship with the young person, or you believe there's an ability there to develop one, and is going to be willing to make a long-term commitment. Somebody that you think is going to be a positive role model and is going to be able to provide support on an as-needed and an ongoing basis. And that's really what you're looking for over the long term here. The sixth principle is that we need to show the kids how to access the assistance and support of the community mentors. So we get these people on board, the people that they've identified. We say, this is what they're going to be here to provide support. And then we have to teach the young people how they're actually going to ask for help and how they're going to contact these people down the road when situations come up, and helping them understand when is it appropriate to contact them, when, what are some of the boundaries there that are involved in that. And so this is where your program can make a lasting impact, right? We're teaching kids how to access resources. If they learn how to do that, then they're not going to be as tied to the need of having a program to guide them through that. Role-playing can be useful here, and you want to set expectations for everybody that's involved. The next principle is to build in local support when the young people are transitioning into new roles here. Now, we want to look for ways to introduce the support of adults in new environments that the young people are entering. So, for instance, let's say you get the kids connected to a trade school or college even. How do we create the kind of support that's there in that new environment where they're going to be in so that they can be successful? I like to think about the example of a foreign exchange student, right? So if we bring in a foreign exchange student, let's think about the kinds of support that we provide to make sure that they're going to be successful. Before they arrive, they get lots of training. They get training in the new language, the new customs. They learn how to cope with being in a new environment by themselves. Then there are people all over the school that have particular roles that are going to be introduced to this student and are going to say, here's what I'm here for. You can contact me for these situations. And so your program can help by creating those links and even putting people in places there. so that they're going to be around, so that we give the young person every chance possible to be successful. And think about if we were talking about a middle-class young person that's going to make the transition into a new environment, what kinds of supports would be available to that young person, and how important those are. That's when we talk about the difference between somebody who is a first-generation college student and somebody who comes from a family where their parents went to college. It's a pretty stark difference in terms of the likelihood of success. And so we want to think about how do we try to substitute those kinds of supports and make sure that it's working the way that we want it to. And then the last thing that I'll say before I turn it over to the next presenter is that you want to monitor your progress, obviously. You want to make sure that you're gathering evidence because that's going to be important for figuring out if what you're doing is making a difference, and also in understanding if how you could modify what you're doing so that you can get an even better outcome. So you want to build a case that what you're doing is actually working, that it's making a difference. So you're going to collect information that's going to help you tell that story. And you want to think about how you determine if what you were doing is working. What are the outcomes that you're looking for? How would you know if what you're doing is working so you can tell that story? And think about whether the outcomes are better for the young person now that you've created this new strategy. And how do we know for sure that if the outcomes are better, it's because of your strategy too? So those are the kinds of questions you want to collect evidence that will help you address. Here's some information.
Thank you.
Okay. Sure.
And we've got Roger's contact information on the screen now. We're going to turn it over to Dennis Talbot. Roger, that was just terrific in terms of the principles, ideas about how to bring them to life. And I think what Dennis is going to do now is help us drill down even deeper. So thank you so much, Roger, for your preparation and your presentation.
Thanks.
Dennis?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. It is a true an honor for me to be with you. I'm going to try to share with you from an experiential perspective how I have engaged this process and how I have used the 23 years of engaging young people in mentoring program and helping them to connect with mentors. So I'm going to do that through a storytelling process. And part of the storytelling process is the story of a young man who I had the privilege of coming in contact with when I was invited to go and speak at the GED graduation for students who were incarcerated in a juvenile detention facility for the state of Michigan. And following my presentation, this young man ran up to me, and his name was Brian, and he says, "I know who you are." And I said, "You do?" And he put his arm around me, and I kind of pulled back a little bit, and he says, "I know who you are." And I said, "Well, how do you know who I am?" And he says, "I know where you live and I know where you work." And I said, "Okay, so where do I work?" He says, "You work across the street from my house." And I said, "Wow, okay, so how did you end up here?" And he began to tell me his story. And his name was Brian. And one of the things that was very unique about Brian is he left home he kind of ran away from home at the age of 12 when the authorities came to remove all of the children from their home. Excuse me, when the authorities came to remove all the children from their home because his mom was an alcoholic and his father was absent. And so they had been engaged in all kinds of criminal activities. And so as a result of that, he fled. And he had 6 brothers and sisters, and the system arrested all 6, but they did not arrest him. And, of course, in the course of that, he somehow ended up in the juvenile justice system. So one of the things that I've come to learn in this whole idea of community mentoring within the life of a mentee is to look at, as Roger talked about, the strengths and the assets the student has. And so we kind of always approach this piece that as I began to talk to Brian, one of the things that Brian said to me, in fact, the name of our agency at that time was the High Risk Mentoring Program. And so Brian quickly told me, as he re-engaged us, that he was tired of being labeled as a high risk. I said, "Oh, wow." And so we realized then that, wait a minute, we've been running around for the last 5 or 6 years And our program is called the High-Risk Mentoring Program, and the students that we're serving don't want to be labeled. And so we decided that it was necessary for us to change the name of that program and to change it in such a way that it was reflective of the students who we were engaging. So the first approach that we had is our students want, if they're going to be involved in some kind of transformational change, they want a new label. And then we also come to realize, as we began to engage Brian, is that every young people in their community has a hero. That represents that positive, caring adult in their lives who may have been in their lives when they were in elementary school. It may have been in their lives when they were in middle school. It may be someone in the block. It could have been someone in their neighborhood. It could have been a relative. But they all have heroes in their lives. And so for us, the issue was trying to identify for Brian, who was that hero? Who was that person that was important in your life when you were growing up? So when you fled home at the age of 12, there must have been someone in your life that was significant. So Brian tells us a story about a young man, or actually he was a retiree, who was his neighbor, who had the ability to repair cars no matter what the circumstances were. He was a retiree took an early retirement from the auto industry because I live in Detroit. And so we said, okay, so how do we connect with him? And he would always talk about how this gentleman taught him so much about the automotive. And remember, Brian left home at 12. But yet this guy began to invest in him as early as 7 and 8 and 9 and began to show him about this whole area of auto mechanics. And so as we began to look at this issue, we said, okay, so one of the things we need to do is we need to try to figure out how can we reconnect Brian back to the person that had such a significant impact on his life, because Brian was a natural auto mechanic. And so we then went back and located this gentleman, and he agreed. He knew Brian, he remembered Brian, and he instantly agreed to be a part of the process. Now, so that caused us to have to look back then now on our whole application process, and then it required us, as we're going through the restructuring of our program, we not only had to restructure our name, but we also had to begin to restructure our application so that it reflected both the positive components of the community. So in redoing our application, we had to make sure that the application drew on the strengths that the guardians and their parents could present, as well as the strengths of the mentees could present to us. What are the things that stood out for them? What are the things that were important to them? What are the things that they wanted to engage? And so we then, going back to the Brian story, we quickly said, okay, Brian wants to be an auto mechanic. Here's the guy in the community who taught him at probably 7, 8, 9, 10, as he began to grow an awful lot about this whole issue of auto mechanics. And so restructuring it. So then we had to figure out, now how do we get adult buy-in? How do we engage this whole adult buy-in? So we went and met with Brian's hero. So we'll call him Hero. And we met this Brian's hero. And we had to help Brian's hero understand that it was not just an issue of being a mentor. It was it was opportunity for him to make an impact on the larger community. For him to see that mentoring was so significant that it could not only help Brian, but it could also help Brian's family and others that were involved in this process. So then we also realized something else, that we could not just take a young man who had been in prison in the juvenile justice system for a significant period of time and think that he could reconnect. And so we had to build this support system for long-term client and mentor support. Because one of the things we realized that, look, even though Brian had a GED, Brian had all kinds of other issues. And part of the long-term other issues is he really had not been involved in. Now, when we met Brian, Brian was 18. So Brian had been away from the system for a significant number of years. And so all he knew was the system. And he had no contact with his family. So how do we build that mentoring support around Brian to make him successful, to help him to become successful? And then begin, we feel like when you start talking about the assets and the strengths, when you build this larger community, you got to begin to tell the story about what you're doing. So let's go to them. So how do you look at the strengths, and who are these heroes that are in the community? A hero could be, as Roger said, it could be a teacher, it could be a minister, it could be someone who's a neighbor, it could be the local business person that the person came in contact with, however limited it may be. It could be a relative, it could be a community leader. Every kid, so we use this term, who is your hero? How do we help you identify that hero, that very special person? And one of the things that we discovered, not only in terms of helping them identify the hero, but also helping them to change the labels, not only as Roger spoke about the kids' healthy environment the kids have to have, and they have the healthy adults and the healthy relationship, but we found something else as we were engaging this process, and that it was helping students engage a healthy mission. This is the whole idea of them giving back to their community, re-engaging their community through whatever the process would be. And then also it was about helping them, and when we start changing the labels, we also knew that it was necessary to help them build a new community. So the two bonuses for us were not only we knew about the healthy environment that kids need, we also knew that they needed these healthy adults. We also knew that they needed these healthy relationships. And one of the things we quickly understood was that, wait a minute, these kids need to re-engage the community from a positive perspective. Service learning. And then we needed to create a community for them that would be different than the community from which they came out. So one of the things that we quickly discovered, and I use this often, and that is the instant advantages. One was trust. When we were able to connect Brian with the community mentor, he had an instant trust, and there was an instant respect. It was also quick. We didn't have to deal with these barriers. The barriers were immediately broke down, because the mentor was connecting with his young man, and the mentee saw this mentor as a hero. And we also saw they were eager to participate in program activities. And there was the instant communication between the mentee and the mentor. And so these are the learning points. But we also, on the flip side, had to make sure that the mentor understood this is not the same kid that he was when he was 7 and 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. He was a mature. He had been involved in the juvenile justice system. And you could not talk with him or talk to him in the same way. You couldn't have the same expectations. And so we had to help them understand, one, that this was not the same person, and two, help them to build a healthy level of respect for this young man. Now, when you are looking at someone who is re-engaging the community, they have a lot of issues that we have to deal with. And so when we're looking at this whole idea of the community mentor or the person who is their hero, someone with whom they could engage, we had to create a learning community. And so building a client learning community with community-based assets, it complements the client's strength. And so for us, our learning community had to deal with the following areas: education, career, mission, experiential or work-based learning service or service learning, and this whole idea of a kinship network, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, and a new community, entrepreneurship, and employment shadowing. Because, again, we wanted to build this learning community in order that this young person could fully engage this activity. So we created this concept called the kinship network. And the kinship network oftentimes represented as many as 5 or 6 individuals who were closely connected with this young man, either through our own program staff. It included the mentor. It included others who would be involved in this person's life for a minimum of 1 year. Because we said, look, the strain that this young man has, because he has a GED, and in Detroit, a GED will get you very little. He has some low self-esteem issues. He has some skills, but how we build upon his skills. And so we created this kinship network. And so the idea is that every client in Reentry has a unique community or a community mentor who is a part of this kinship network. And the network consists of agency staff, mentors, parents, guardians, and others who are committed to that client's success. And again, this is building a community around the mentee. Each member of the network has a general responsibility, and they have a single responsibility. And that single responsibility, for instance, if I were a part of someone's kinship network, I could be the education person. And someone else may be responsible for housing. Someone else may be responsible for helping this person work with employment issues. And then there's this whole issue of leisure time. How do we help the student to re-engage or rethink leisure time and environment? How we help them work through some of the environmental issues that they're engaging. So even though each one of us took a responsibility, in that element of each one of us taking a responsibility, we will also meet as a group. But it would take, as a volunteer, it takes a whole lot less time for me as I'm focusing my attention on one item versus trying to help this person through a multiple list of items. We recognize that reentry clients are often extremely needy and require far more time than a traditional mentoring relationship. So that's why this kinship network was and is so important. We insisted that the kinship network meets at least twice monthly during the first 6 months of the community placement or their release. And in some cases, the phone conference is acceptable, but we really wanted them to meet collectively at least 4 times during that period of time. And then they met monthly. They meet monthly from the 7th to 12th month, and then after that, they kind of set their own schedule. But the idea is building a community of individuals who are committed to this one person. So we look at the Brian story. And so the Brian story is such that we met him in a juvenile justice system. He connects with our agency. He begins to understand that there is someone in his life, there's someone who was very, very important in his life, someone who helped him with some skill-based issues with respect to auto mechanics. We went out, discovered, and met with this person, began to train him on this whole idea of becoming a mentor. He gets excited about not only what he is going to be able to do for Brian, but for his own self-esteem, how he is engaging a larger issue of mentoring, what he's doing to contribute to the betterment of his community. He then connects with Brian. The relationship goes on and on and on. He begins to continue right where he left off in terms of helping Brian with his auto mechanic skills, et cetera, et cetera. He invites Brian to go and join him in his workplace in terms of the work that he does on the side. Brian then takes entrepreneurial classes. Brian learns to become an entrepreneur. Brian learns some basic business essentials. Brian becomes an auto mechanic. Brian moves on from auto mechanics to ultimately working in a repair shop. And in the community, he finds a building that he can ultimately purchase. Brian becomes an auto mechanic. Brian buys this building. Brian rents this building. Brian now is a success in our community. And it all begins, from our perspective, is Brian being able to reconnect with the person who was his hero, who was willing to re-engage him as an adult. And we see that over and over and over and over again. So it works. And so here's some expected outcomes as from a mentoring program. First, the client has a shorter period of building a healthy community. Secondly, the mentor-mentee relationship has much stronger connections. 3, the client feels empowered, trusted, and needed. Because, again, when you build this kinship network, remember the client or the mentee is a part of the network. He is involved in helping to make the decisions that are important for his life. And he is an equal engager. The client has a natural, long-term, healthy community. Because of the relationship, it's just a natural reconnection. The client is building or has built a healthy self-esteem about himself because, again, he is reconnecting with his community. He's engaged in service learning projects. He's doing all kinds of things that are helping him to feel good about himself. The client has a healthy relationship with our agency. You can begin to see the positive changes in the client's core family values because of the things that we pour in through the kinship network, and the client has the powerful desire to re-engage the community from a positive perspective.
Dennis, that was terrific. And you can see the contact information for Dennis on the screen now. Just between what Roger and Dennis have provided you thus far in the webinar, I hope you see that we're really building this kind of mentoring network of supports that is almost mentoring on steroids. It's everything you want for a young person transitioning into adulthood, transitioning back into community, which so many of our young people are doing both of those things, not just for the short haul, but for the long haul. So what I want to do now is turn the webinar over to David Altshuler for David to talk about mentorship in a reentry or reintegration context. So how do these pieces fit into the flow that we see offenders experience between entry into placement, the point of reentry, and the community-based phase? And with that, I'll turn it over to David.
Thank you, Shay, and thank you very much, Roger and Dennis. I think up to this point you've heard a great deal of some really important, useful information based on experience and practice, expertise and research as far as mentorship in general, mentorship as it relates to the use of community mentors. What I want to talk about for just a short while is taking what we have heard and learned from Roger and Dennis and thinking about how it can be incorporated into the broader context of reintegration and reentry. And what I'm doing is drawing upon a large body of work that's been going on for quite a long while by a number of people, including myself, in which we have focused across the country on a great deal of what's been going on as far as the quote-unquote reentry, transition, reintegration, and community aftercare associated with young people who are initially placed out of home in a variety of different kinds of settings, including secure juvenile facilities, and then ultimately are transitioned back into the community. And I think based on what we've heard, what we need to be thinking about is how we can take this information and these principles and the specifics of programming and program design and incorporate it into the entire continuum of reintegration or reentry. And in order to do that, I want to just sort of take you through exactly what we're talking about in terms of the different stages. Because when we think about reentry, typically we hear that reentry begins at day one. And that day one generally refers to the point of admission to a facility of one sort or another. And so the question then becomes, if that youngster is going to be in that facility for 3 months, for 6 months, for 8 or 9 months, we need to be thinking about exactly what's being done during that period of time, both in relation to that youngster, working with that youngster and that youngster's systems from the community, so that they can be prepared to leave the facility and go back into the community, and simultaneously so the community can be prepared to receive this youngster. So when I say community, obviously I'm referring to a wide range of players, and that would include the assigned mentors and community mentors. Some folks use the term to mean that natural helpers, informal supports, indigenous supports. But the fact of the matter is that when we begin to identify through eco-mapping a number of people and places and groups, individuals who need to be incorporated into this whole mentorship relationship, that process, I think, if it started early enough, can be folded in various ways to what's going on while this young person is in the facility or in the placement. And the virtue of that is they begin to get exposure to something other than only that which happens within the confines of a facility program. Because we know that it's not unusual to get very inwardly focused on adjustment, compliance, behavioral management, safety and security within a particular facility. And that makes perfectly good sense. The problem is sometimes that tends to overshadow everything else. And I think from the perspective of the involvement of mentors, we have to think about very systematic and organized ways that we can begin to get this whole process of identifying mentors, training of mentors, mentors beginning to interact with the kids, mentors beginning to interact with others in the community that may become a part of that kinship network that Dennis was talking about. But that is going to be best accomplished, I would submit to you, starting very, very early. Now, the truth of the matter is we've got multiple stages, as you can see in the slide that's in front of you. So if you think about it, these multiple stages relate to particular periods of time that young people are involved in the continuum of juvenile justice, and then extending after. So stage one would be from the point of admission all the way through the point at which there's an effort to finalize the plans for ultimately being removed from the facility and reentering the community. And so the transition from placement, sometimes referred to as when pre-release planning occurs or when discharge planning occurs, is what I'm referring to as stage 2A. But the truth of the matter is, in stage 2A, we need to be finalizing things, not starting things. Those things need to be started much earlier for a whole variety of reasons, not the least of which is there's times when we don't actually know when release is going to come. So we might be waiting 30 or 60 days prior to release, and all of a sudden release is around the corner, and we don't have that time. So we've waited so long that we're no longer in a position to be able to actually do that. We need to start that at the very beginning. And I believe that it's very important that the concepts that we were hearing about from Roger and Dennis be incorporated at the very early period within stage 1. Then, of course, as we go into stage 2A, activity accelerates in terms of preparation for an imminent release. And then in stage 2B, we've got the actual reentry back into the community. And whether we're using a step-down facility or various kinds of services depending upon need and level of risk, 2B is a very, very active period where we're monitoring exactly what's going on. This is where mentors need to be on board, I would argue, and that we've got to get these mentors fully engaged well before stage 2B in order to get the most benefit that we were hearing from Roger and Dennis about. And that really cannot begin at stage 2B. And then, of course, stage 3A is for young people who are going to be over the longer term on some form of juvenile justice supervision and custody, whether it's on some form of community aftercare or probation or parole. We need to be thinking about the fact that there are going to be a number of other players. And we've got to get mentorship embraced by and integrated into what a whole variety of different players and systems are doing. If we don't do that, we run the risk that whatever benefit that we can get from mentorship, we may unintentionally undermine it because of things that are being done by some of the other players. And then the final stage is 3B. And I think this refers to much longer term, and I believe both Roger and Dennis refer to this in terms of much longer term ability to manage in a law-abiding way the transition to adulthood, life in the community, and hopefully as these young people move on, they're going to have a system in place through, in fact, community mentors and natural helpers, various informal supports and other systems. Those things are going to be in place to help these young people when they're no longer involved in the justice system. But that's not going to happen on its own. So it seems to me we can think about how we can incorporate mentorship, as Roger and Dennis were discussing it, through each of the stages. And the slide that you're looking at right now, what you can see is that there are a number of columns. And you might think of those columns as what sometimes gets referred to as silos. And in fact, they look like little silos. And potentially, we need to be very careful about those silos becoming so focused strictly on what it is that is being done by those officers or that staff or those providers, potentially to the disadvantage of others who are going to need to be a part of the team. So the team needs to include representatives from all of the different systems, providers, groups, the mentors, the faith-based community. And the question that we have to ask ourselves is, how can we design these reentry programs, which need to begin very, very early during stage one, so that we can introduce to these young people and their situations a whole variety of players, some of which might become active in different ways somewhat later, or much more active somewhat later, but we need to be able to work toward that. Now, this gets into really the nitty-gritty of what it takes to, for example, get a mentor to be able to interact, communicate with, have access to young people during stage one. And as a lot of us know, sometimes it's hard enough to even get community correctional staff into some facilities, let alone mentors or provider groups or volunteers. So it seems to me that we've got to build in a very systemic and organized way exactly what the expectations are, so that folks in facilities and that folks that have main responsibility for doing the transition coordination and establishing the pre-release plan are cognizant of and incorporating into how they're operating and what they're doing the mentors. Now, that obviously means that the mentors have to be identified very early. The training that we heard talked about needs to happen very early, and they need to be brought on board. And one of the things that I think we heard from both Roger and Dennis is that that group of mentors, assigned, community, and others, may over time, and in fact, hopefully will over time, grow to more and more people. But the point is that I think early on we've got to be able to set the stage so that there is some receptivity at the level of the facility during stage 1 and 2A to have assigned mentors and community mentors as they become identified and brought in to begin to interact and communicate. And so this gets into things like visitation policy. This gets into issues around clarity of expectations in terms of how a day gets scheduled and at what point folks from the outside can come in. And as we know, with regard to correctional facilities, sometimes these can be major impediments to actually accomplishing things that involve anybody from the outside. So it seems to me that if you take a look at this matrix, what we need to be thinking about is how and in what ways will, to take the example of mentors, become involved in stage 1. What is it that mentors can be doing in the community? What is it that they can be doing in terms of communication and engagement of the youth during stage 1? And in order to accomplish that, I think we're going to have to be very, very clear and explicit with regard to facility staff, with regard to the folks who are doing discharge planning, probation and parole folks, other specialized providers, that the expectation is that we're talking about a comprehensive team. And for this team to work, certain things need to happen. And we need to stay on top of that to make sure that implementation obstacles don't emerge that get into the way of that actually occurring. So again, if you think about each of these columns as potentially being silos, we can understand why it may turn out that each one of these silos operates fairly independent of one another, left to their own devices. So I would argue in favor of a team approach that very explicitly incorporates mentorship, and that the roles and responsibilities of the mentors and all the others who are involved, the other stakeholders in relationship to the mentors, are carefully spelled out, and that this is monitored over time. When you get to the point when you're thinking about stage 2B, for example, or stage 3A, we now have another set of considerations, and that has to do with those conditions of release, those parole and probation conditions. And we know that there are times when those conditions themselves actually can make it very, very difficult for young people to be able to manage, to be able to stay on top of things, and to stay out of trouble in terms of compliance with a host of different requirements. It seems to me that we need to be thinking about these parole and probation and community conditions. And we need to make sure that we don't end up in a situation where mentors and probation officers or parole officers have a very different mind in terms of what happens when there is a problem that surfaces or when a particular challenge emerges. We really need to begin to think very team-wide about these conditions. Now, it may well be that the conditions are imposed by a court or the conditions may be imposed by a release authority. And so it seems to me that by incorporating mentors in various ways in these conditions and utilizing them as both the potential for incentives as well as consequences when there are some problems around, particularly abiding by conditions, that we might be able to head off a bigger problem down the road. Because we know that it's a lot of these technical violations and conditions that can sometimes create problems in these young people being able to make it. And it seems to me that there's another role that mentors could play, but that means that if it's the judiciary or if it's probation and parole, that they really need to be open to the idea of bringing in to the discussion about what an appropriate condition would be and what an appropriate response would be when there is some version of noncompliance and so on and so forth. So really, the major point that I want to make here is that it seems to me that the very valuable information that we've received from Roger and Dennis needs to be incorporated in a very systematic and explicit way into the entire reintegration continuum, and that we need to be thinking about everything from visitation rules and regulations to how we're going to train staff collectively who may have some very, very different views about what the priorities are and what things should be allowed to go on and not go on. And in order to do that, we're going to have to come up with a clear set of policies and procedures that address the issue of mentorship and the use of natural helpers and others so that we can get the most benefit that would be possible to get mentors involved. And just to close, let me say again, I think that we've got to get this whole mentorship effort up and rolling at the very, very beginning, as closest to the point of admission as we possibly can. There's no time to waste. We may have months and months where a lot could be accomplished in preparation for release, both in terms of the young people as well as the community, and we could use that in order ultimately to increase the chances that when these young people get back out in the community, they're going to be able to be law-abiding, that the community is going to be receptive to them, and that as we go down the road, we're doing the best that we possibly can to create a support system for them that's going to be there as they transition to adulthood and ultimately become, one would hope, a tax-paying, well-employed member of the community. And thank you so much.
Great, David. Thank you very much. And I think Steve gave us contact information on the sheet now, and I want to thank all three panelists for their presentations. I think that Roger and Dennis really brought us some intensity of focus around this network of support we're trying to create for kids through the mentoring concept, but well beyond the traditional notions of the mentoring formal relationship. And then, David, thank you so much for putting it into the context of how this fits into our planning around reentry, from institutional placement to planning for exit and then finally back in the community. So I want to open it up for questions now. I think you know the rules of the game, so to speak. There's a place on your computer form there to type in the questions at the lower right-hand corner. We have received a few questions, so I'm going to move forward with those, and a few others have come through the phone. So we'll go ahead and launch them with our panel. The first question deals with the money and whether our panelists are familiar with any funding outside of Second Chance Act that can help support this type of programming. So other federal agencies, federal programs outside of mentoring programs, more general funding programs. I'm going to turn this to both Roger and Dennis to start with to see if you can identify for our participants the types of funding streams that might be utilized for this type of programming.
So I'll go ahead and start. You might pay attention to the funding that's available in your states through the Title II and the JBIG funds. Reentry is one of the priority areas that states can choose to fund programs in, and So I think that's an option. We know that the coordinating council, the Attorney General's office at the federal level has coordinating council going on, and one of the 4 priority areas is reentry. And this could translate into more funds available down the road. We don't know that it's going to do that necessarily, but that's something that I would encourage you to keep an eye out for. That's what I know of right at this point.
Dennis, anything to add to that?
Yeah, we've taken a traditional and non-traditional funding strategy approach. One is to look at your community foundation, and there are generally some local foundation is interested in reentry or is interested specifically in juvenile justice-related issues. And so I would definitely look in that area first. Then the other thing that we have done is we've been able to identify corporations that would sponsor juvenile justice reentry projects, not specifically the PROPIS itself, but, for instance, they would sponsor our volunteer banquets and those kinds of things. So we've had 2 or 3 programs. And the third item is we have gone to communities gone to the community with a direct giving campaign. So there are, at least in the metropolitan Detroit area, at least 2 major foundations that are interested, and you'll also find that there's some national foundations that are interested in reentry work.
And I would add to that, Roger and Dennis. I'd add to that I think people should look through the main block grant or formula funding from the federal agencies or the sub-grants that are given through the states. So the Department of Labor, Department of Education, OJJDP at the U.S. Department of Justice. You'll find some of the formula funds that could be utilized for application to reentry and mentoring supports for young people who are at risk. Specifically at the OJJDP funding stream, we have the Gang Prevention Youth Mentoring Program, the Mentoring Initiative for Foster Care Youth, and Strategic Enhancement to Mentoring Programs. All are funding streams that are available to the public. I'd also look at the U.S. Department of Education Title I Part D monies that come into your state. Subparts 1 and 2 are for disadvantaged youth, youth at risk, youth in the juvenile justice system, youth in the foster care system, and those are several different funding stream ideas that I would add to what has been suggested by Roger and Dennis. We have another question I want to pose to the panel, and I love this one. I love this idea of youth nominated mentors for several reasons. How do you frame the request of the mentor? I can see some mentors feeling like they don't need training to talk to youth in their lives. How do you frame their incentives to participate?
Well, we start out by letting them know that every mentor needs training. And then second line is, this person that we are training you to engage, we're helping you to understand that he or she is not the same person you met wherever in the distance, whenever it is you knew them. So we found that by creating a very interactive, fun experience, the potential mentors really enjoy it. They come. Part of what we are also interested in doing is building this whole idea of the of the mentor community. And so in building a mentor community, you want to make it fun. You want to make it a social kind of engagement as well as a learning environment for the mentors. But I just have not had mentors reject us on the training.
Right, and I think what we're hearing today is the suggestion that this isn't the handoff. This isn't saying to someone, we want you to mentor this kid and good luck to you. It really becomes part of a case management process where they're part of a team that's working for the young person with the young person to a better outcome. And I hope that would incentivize people's participation, that it isn't being handed off to them as much as they're joining an effort to change a young person's life in a significant way where they're part of a team. I have another question from a residential commitment provider. They operate residential commitment facilities that serve youth statewide. We want to know what the thoughts are for developing mentors and maintaining momentum and sustainability from 500 miles away from the community in which the youth is returning to. So if we go with David's notion that we start these relationships before the juvenile has left the institution, how are we doing that? How are we sustaining the momentum behind that when they could be as much, sounds like a pretty big state, as much as 500 miles away?
So I'll share from our experiential engagement. First of all, David, really appreciate your presentation. For us, we take once we've identified the person, we actually take them to the facility where they are, where they're at. And we connect them with them for a couple of hours just to see how this relationship is going to go. If it goes great, and we have not had a situation where it's not, then it is about writing, and we help the person to facilitate writing with them, connecting with, if they had a relationship with someone in their family, connecting with their family, making sure that significant days, holidays, and birthdays are always either it's a connection with their, we try to get the facility that we work with, and in our case, we work with Boysville of Michigan, now known as Holy Cross Children's Services. We try to allow them to get permission for them to make as many visits as possible. So as an agency, we facilitate that visit, which means that we will either reimburse the person their travel costs, or we ourselves will take them up there.
If I could just make a comment, it seems to me that when you're talking about substantial distances, 500 miles, 800 miles, in some instances much longer than that, quite frankly, particularly where you have young people who are being placed far out of state or far away in a very, very large state. That's a very real consideration. And I would like to think that the identification of mentors that Roger and Dennis were talking about is something that would begin to kick in as quickly after the point at which a child is taken into a facility. That the identification of those folks, the contact between the mentoring program that's going to be working in helping the mentors get prepared, get trained, needs to happen right away. This is time to take advantage of. And then that initial set of contacts, especially when you're talking about very, very substantial differences, where it might be possible somewhat to have some actual in-person visitation, but maybe not very much. And depending on how long the child's going to be in the place, it could be many, many months. We could be thinking about regular telephone conversations. We could think about letters. We could think about video conferencing. It seems to me that the more contact that we could encourage at the earliest stages possible, and it doesn't necessarily have to be all in person. It could be done a number of other ways. And these days, particularly with video conferencing, I think there's a lot more possible than ever before. Helps to kind of cement that relationship. Contacts around, as Dennis was indicating, birthdays and holidays. I think you want to develop as tight a relationship between mentor and mentee as early on as possible, so that when that youngster is going to be leaving that facility, or for that matter, making a home visit or on a day release or a furlough, that you could really build on that with the mentor right away. You don't want to wait until shortly before there's going to be a release, because it seems to me that's wasting a lot of valuable time.
Thank you, David. I want to just briefly comment on the video conferencing. I think with the advent of technology, the use of Skype or whatever other similar modality, we have the ability, if we're really working as a team, to have the probation worker, the aftercare worker, a team with the mentors. If we're broadening the reach here to people who know this young person in a variety of ways, in addition to new mentors, then this isn't a stranger that we're keeping them in touch with. And so the use of what Dave is suggesting here through technology is important. More and more departments are using laptops. Those probation or aftercare workers with their laptops with Wi-Fi can be visiting the mentors and hooking up to the facility and going online with the young person to create that connection. So I think
I'd just like to add If I could just add one other thing, I want to underscore something David said earlier in his remarks. I think here's where you have to really put the pressure on the facilities to be a good partner in this as well. And they have to let down some of the barriers that are going to keep some of these things from happening. And because their first reaction is going to be to some of this, oh, we don't allow that here, but we really have to encourage them to let some of this happen, because they're only making it more likely that these kids are going to take advantage of that support when they get out, if we can help build a relationship while they're inside.
Great. Actually, so we've got a lot of questions coming in, so I'm going to ask the panelists to try to keep the answers as succinct as possible so we can get to a lot of these good questions. First one is, I imagine some youth will nominate a mentor who might not pass a criminal background check. How would you handle this? We couldn't tell the youth the mentor didn't pass the check, but also wouldn't want to say the mentor was uninterested.
Well, to be honest with you, I haven't arrived at that conclusion, but I would not tell the person that he didn't pass the background test, but I would certainly ask them for not just one name, but for several names.
Right, and
I've not experienced that at this point, but I know that's a real possibility. And then,
this comes up, Dennis, in terms of foster care, where we're doing family group conferencing or team decision-making, and the youth identifies the people they would like to have involved with them or to live with if they don't have a suitable placement. Mm-hmm. And we've got to screen those individuals to see who will pass muster. And sometimes they will simply not, by state law or local code, court rule, be someone eligible for the young person to live with. I think there's a way to finesse that conversation without having to reveal the details of the background checks. I would agree with you. So let me ask another question here. How long is it appropriate to keep a young person on aftercare, even with this mentoring relationship? Do we get to a point of diminishing or negative return?
I think we do. I think we definitely do. And that's the reason why it's so important to closely monitor how the young people are doing. And if we stay with them too long in a kind of restrictive type situation, there's every reason to believe that things can start to go downhill very quickly. So I want to suggest to you that a very regular kind of calibration, if things are going well for a period of time, and it could be a very short period of time, that there is some kind of very concrete and clear-cut manifestation that things are going well, and there's some kind of either privilege or some type of reward or incentive associated with that. And if things continue to go well, you stay on that path. So my answer is you monitor closely enough, and you have within your arsenal ways to actually properly respond to achievement, success, and accomplishment, and not only, not be the kind of place that simply is responding to misconduct and problems, but have a very good system for responding to things going well, and to very regularly in short intervals be checking on that and reacting, and then hopefully within a shorter period of time than might otherwise be the case, you could at least lower the level to such that it would not be particularly onerous.
And I don't think we can emphasize enough that the whole idea here is to create in aftercare a period of time to stabilize the young person, make sure they're back on the right track, and they have the supports they need to maintain that for a period of time. The whole notion of what I think Roger and Dennis and David have suggested today is how we put into place supports that will last well beyond when the system is involved with a young person. They'll become part of the norm for them, not institutionally imposed or system imposed, but part of the supports I think that Dennis and Roger have been talking about that we want for those young people that otherwise would not have been there. There's a question here about an observation and a question. It's very difficult to train mentors when they come in one at a time to mentor youth in day treatment. Do you know of any DVD programs that would be beneficial or some other form of training technology? Have we gotten that sophisticated yet, Dennis or Roger, that we've got the training on DVDs, interactive training, online training?
I know that TCAM is working on some e-learning modules.
And TCAM is?
Yes, we're working on some e-learning modules that will be available probably within the next 2 to 3 months.
If you can just explain to people again what TCAM is.
TCAM is the Center for the Advancement of Mentoring, for which Roger and I are senior consultants.
Right. And that's the nationally funded center in part by Department of Justice.
That is funded by the Department of Justice Office of Juvenile Justice and Drug Prevention.
Okay. So you're developing that kind of capacity.
Yeah, I'm working on some modules now that should be ready, like I said, within the next couple of months.
And would those be interactively delivered on the Internet? Would they be through DVD? What would they be?
They'll be Internet-driven, and you'll be able to go to our website, which is advancedmentoring.org.
I think yes, that's right.
Mentoring.org. You'll be able to go to our website at any point and be able to go to the e-learning communities and use them whenever you want to use it.
Here's a question that's come in. Are there any initiatives or grants that aim to recruit mentors from various ethnic or racial backgrounds?
I am not aware of any specifically.
I think some grants have been given out to programs that provide technical assistance to certain mentoring for Native American youth, mentoring for Hispanic youth. So there are some out there that are working specifically with targeted ethnic racial backgrounds.
Great. There's a question asking for clarification, and I mentioned some different funding streams. One of them was called JBIG. It's actually the Juvenile Accountability Block Grant Program administered through the U.S. Department of Justice, and those monies come down through state agencies and through the District of Columbia to be sub-granted out to local providers. So that is one funding stream. And I also mentioned Title I, Part D, Subparts 1 and 2 of the U.S. Department of Education, their authorization. And that is a funding stream that's specifically targeting youth who are at risk, youth in the juvenile justice system, and youth who are in the foster care system.
And Shay, there's a website that is linked to the Department of Education for the TA provider that may be of interest to folks on the call.
Great. There's another question along the training line, Roger and Dennis, about what are some cultural training resources for working with Native youth who reenter the community? Have we identified any of those at this point?
That's not an area of expertise for me, but I know there are some out there, and we have, so the organization that we're involved with through the Center for the Advancement of Mentoring, they are also involved in providing technical assistance to mentoring programs for Native American youth. And so we could probably if you contacted me outside of this call, I'd be happy to connect you with those resources.
I would also suggest people go to the U.S. Department of Justice website for their tribal youth program, where, while not more narrowly focused on reentry issues per se, there will be a tremendous amount of resource information there about cultural training opportunities and resources for youth in the juvenile justice system or in the tribal justice system. I do have a question also about the idea of, David, having the mentors or the supports start early. Would you suggest special training for mentors who are going to go up to the facilities and spend time with the youth in the facilities? Is there some type of special training about the system, about the experience the youth is having that you suggest in that situation? Roger and Dennis, feel free to jump in on this as well.
Yeah, great question. I think that's going to take a real concerted effort. And I would add that this is not just training for mentors. This needs to actually include folks from the facility in a variety of different levels, because it seems to me that there's all kinds of issues that emerge, and Roger referenced some of this in terms of getting access to a facility, much less a particular kid at a facility, because there's set schedules. There are places that don't like to have any deviation from a set schedule. There are places where the only time you can go in is at a weekend when clinical staff, for example, are not there and other important staff are not there. So it seems to me that both the planning for what the training ought to be and who it is that's a part of that training needs to be very carefully thought through in advance. And so I would endorse what I think the caller is implying, which is a need to have some very specialized, focused training issues around when you can get to a facility, what it's going to take to actually link up with a child, how long you're going to have, whether or not there are going to be other staff there, and so on and so forth.
And I'd like to add, too, I think it's important before the young person leaves the facility to do some really directed training with the mentor and the young person about how they're going to be in touch with each other in the community, how they're going to make connection, help them interpret. So what does it mean for the young person if when they call the mentor doesn't get right back, and help them have those conversations ahead of time, because if you wait till they get back to the community, sometimes they lose touch for reasons that we could have prevented. And so helping them think about and plan ahead for, here's how I'm going to contact you when my phone gets disconnected, here's somebody you can contact that will always know where I'm at, those kinds of things. Be helpful to kind of model and role play and work through before they're released in the community.
I have one more comment and one more question. We'll try to squeeze in real quick before we get to the top of the hour. The comment was an observation from one of our listeners that there's a seventh-generation mentoring program that the Education Development Center administers at www.edc.org, and there'll be some resource materials there around mentoring programs. I'm assuming this might be tribal-related. The last question. Many jurisdictions now are developing reentry courts, and these reentry courts may be an opportunity for the young person having reentered the community right away to appear in court with their support system, with their caseworker, with their family, with their mentors, both formal and informal. Do you all see this as an important development in the field to kind of formalize these relationships in a way, Dennis, maybe to institute the Permanency Pacts in open court? Is this a vehicle with more and more reentry courts being formed to solidify and formalize what the expectations are around the supports a young person will receive while the system is involved and after?
Well, for me, I am a strong advocate of community placement, particularly for nonviolent juveniles. And so I think it's a great opportunity for your program, for the juvenile justice system to connect all the dots. I think one of the things that we keep hearing over and over again from this call is that we need to make sure that everyone who's involved in the system is committed to this whole idea of making sure the students are able to get these mentors as early as possible. So my own feeling is as soon as the student enters the juvenile justice system, even before he or she has been sentenced, we should be looking at how do we connect them with mentoring programs or with a mentor, because we know that there's some things in their background that will lead to them re-engaging even if they're not convicted.
Thank you, Dennis. Roger or David, any comment about the use of reentry courts in tandem with these ideas we talked about today?
Well, one quick response. Let me just say that in jurisdictions where the judiciary actually has authority as it relates to reentry, it's certainly an option to consider. But as we've known with regard to some drug courts and some other specialty courts, they haven't necessarily always incorporated principles and approaches that would necessarily be in accordance with some of the things that we heard today. So regardless of whether it's a quote-unquote reentry court or if it's an independent youth authority that has authority over young people when they are going into a reentry status, it seems to me that we have to hold everybody accountable to principles and requirements, and it's a little bit less important as to the form or the mechanism that's taken to do that.
Thank you very much. And with that, as an appropriate final comment, bringing a lot of what we've talked about today together, I want to thank Roger and Dennis and David for their preparation and presentation today. Really outstanding. And I want to remind the audience that we will email a link to the recording of this presentation to all the participants in the next few days so you can pass that along to others. To learn about future NRC webinars, the National Reentry Resource Center, and our distance learning opportunities, please sign up for our newsletter at www.nationalreentryresourcecenter.org. the email address you're seeing or website you're seeing on the PowerPoint presentation. And please, after the webinar concludes, please complete a brief survey about this webinar. It will pop up on your screen. We need your feedback. This is an important mechanism for us to support the field, provide information you think is important. We listen very carefully to the feedback that we get. And with that, I bid you all adieu. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.